Hey everyone, thanks to Quincy and the research team for putting this all together. Welcome back to Canada News Summaries. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jane.
So Jane, we've got this interesting topic to dig into today. Ontario Premier Doug Ford just announced those $200 rebates for every taxpayer in Ontario. What was your initial reaction to that?
Well, Mike, on the surface it sounds great. Who
Uh-huh.
doesn't love a little extra cash? But I think we need to look past the headlines and think about the context. We're talking about a cost of living crisis. Inflation is still a concern, and there's an election coming up. So the timing and the reasoning behind this are definitely worth looking into.
Yeah, you make a good point about the timing. This is all happening just a couple of years before the next election. And Ford hasn't exactly ruled out calling an early election this year either. So it's hard not to think that this is more about politics than actually helping Ontarians.
Exactly. And I think it's important for listeners to be aware of that. Is this really about helping people who are struggling? Or is it just to make Ford more popular before an election? It could be both. But understanding the motivation helps us be more critical.
For sure. So let's get into the details of this rebate.
Yeah.
Who exactly qualifies for this $200?
It's actually pretty broad. Anyone who was 18 or older at the end of last year and filed their 2023 taxes on time is eligible. That includes millionaires, billionaires, even non-citizens if they paid taxes in Ontario last year.
Wow, so there's no income limits at all. Even the wealthiest people are getting this. I imagine some people might not be happy about that.
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions. Should the government be giving money to everyone or just people who really need it? There are good arguments on both sides. Giving it to everyone is easier and avoids making anyone feel bad about needing help. But it also means a lot of the money is going to people who don't need it. And that might mean less help for the people who are struggling the most.
That's a really important point.
hmm
And on top of that, we have to consider the cost of all this. We're talking about $3 billion. Is this really the best way to use that money? Especially when there's so many other things we could be spending it on, like healthcare and education.
Exactly. And then there's where the money's actually coming from. The government says it's because they got more money from sales taxes than they expected, and that's partly because of inflation. But is it really extra money if it's just because people are having to spend more on everything?
It's a tough situation. The government is giving back money that people might not have had to spend if prices weren't so high in the first place.
Right. And the other reason they give is the changes to the federal capital gains tax. That does give the province more money, but it's not clear how much of an impact that's actually had on this program. It would be good to have more information about that.
I agree. And while we're talking about things that need more explanation, let's talk about the extra $200 per child.
So that money is automatically going to whoever gets the Canada Child benefit for that child. That seems pretty simple for most families, but it's not clear what happens in more complicated situations.
Yeah, like what about shared custody? Or families who don't get the CCB for some reason?
The government says there's another way to get the money in those cases, but they haven't explained how it works yet. It's worrying that they haven't been clear about this, especially for families who really need that money. They need to make sure everyone who's eligible can get it without any problems.
It sounds like there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah.
But one thing that is clear is just how many people this will affect. The government says 12.5 million Ontarians will get the rebate, plus payments for about 2.5 million children. That's a lot of money going out, Ray.
It is, and I think that's something for listeners to think about. $200 might not seem like much on its own, but when you multiply that by millions of people, it could have a big impact on the economy. Will it cause prices to go up even more? Will it help the economy grow? These are questions worth considering.
Those are some great points, Jane. I think we should take a minute to think about what we've talked about so far. We've looked at how the rebate program works. We've talked about why the government might be doing this. And we've raised some questions about how it might affect the economy.
And we've also talked about how there's still some things that aren't clear, especially for families with shared custody or who don't get the CCB. The government needs to be clear about how this will work and make sure the program is fair and helps the people who need it most.
Exactly. But before we move on, I think we need to ask the most important question. Will this $200 actually make a difference for people who are struggling to make ends meet? We'll talk about that and what it might mean for the economy in general when we come back. Don't forget to follow, like, and share this podcast with your friends so they can join the conversation. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canada News Summaries. Before the break, we were talking about whether this $200 rebate will actually make a difference for people who are struggling.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, for some families, $200 could be a huge help, especially for people who are just barely getting by. It could be a week's worth of groceries, or help pay a bill, or even fix something that's broken. In those cases, every little bit helps.
Yeah, I can see that. But for other people who are already doing okay, this rebate might feel like extra money
No.
rather than something they really need.
Exactly. And that's where the debate about universal programs versus targeted programs comes in. Some people say that giving everyone the same amount of money, regardless of how much they make, is not a good use of money. They say it would be better to focus on programs that give more help to people who really need it.
That makes sense. What are some examples of those kinds of targeted programs?
Well, instead of giving everyone $200, the government could have put more money into existing social assistance programs. Or they could have made it easier for people to get housing subsidies. Or invested more in affordable childcare. These kinds of programs would help the people who are most affected by the rising cost of living.
Those are good examples. It seems like there might be better ways to use this money, especially considering it's going to cost $3 billion.
Yeah, and even though the government says they can afford it because of higher sales tax revenue and changes to the capital gains tax, we have to think about what this might mean for the economy in the long run.
Like what kind of things?
Well, one concern is that putting $3 billion into the economy all at once could make inflation worse. If everyone starts spending more money at the same time, but there isn't more stuff available, prices will go up.
So this rebate could actually end up making things more expensive.
It's possible, and it makes you wonder if this is a sustainable way to deal with the cost of living problem.
It all goes back to our discussion about why the government might be doing this. With an election coming up, it's hard to ignore the fact that this might be a way to get more votes.
You're right, and this is something I think listeners should really think about. Is this rebate really about helping people, or is it more about politics?
That's a question worth asking, especially as we get closer to the election. We need to be aware of how politics can affect the decisions the government makes, and we need to think critically about those decisions.
And remember, this rebate is just one small part of a much bigger problem. It might help people in the short term, but it doesn't fix the underlying reasons why the cost of living is going up.
So even though this $200 might be helpful for some people, it's important to remember that it's not a permanent solution. We need to keep asking our elected officials to address the root causes of the cost of living crisis and to find solutions that will make a real difference for everyone.
Absolutely. And speaking of finding solutions, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What do you think about this Ontario rebate program? How do you think it will affect you and your community? Share your thoughts with us on social media, and let's keep talking about this.
Welcome back to Canada News Summaries. We've been talking all about this Ontario rebate program and what it all means.
It's been a really interesting discussion, hasn't it? We've looked at so many different aspects of it, from how it works to what might be motivating it to whether it's fair or not.
And we've heard from you, our listeners, too. It seems like people have a lot of different opinions about this. Some people think it's really needed, while others think it's not going to make much of a difference, or that it's just a political move.
And it's good to hear those different perspectives. It helps us understand just how complicated this issue really is.
So as we wrap things up, what are your final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the biggest thing to remember is don't just take what you hear at face value. Dig a little deeper. Ask questions and think about the bigger picture. This rebate might seem simple, but it's actually connected to a lot of bigger issues, like the economy, social justice, and politics.
That's a really important point. We all need to be informed and engaged citizens to understand how things like this affect us.
Yeah.
And to make sure our elected officials are doing what's best for everyone.
Exactly. And this is just one piece of the puzzle. The cost of living is a complex issue, and there's no easy fix. This rebate might help for a little while, but it doesn't solve the bigger problems.
So what can people do to stay involved and keep learning about these issues even after they're done listening?
There are a lot of things you can do. Stay up to date on what's happening in politics, both locally and provincially. Talk to your elected representatives, and get involved in community discussions about the things that matter to you. Your voice makes a difference.
Well said, Jane. It's been great talking about all this with you. Thanks again to Quincy and the research team for all their work. And a big thank you to our listeners for joining us today. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed, and don't forget to follow, like, and share Canada News Summaries with everyone you know.